I like to say that I write about what I call the 14th Amendment people. And what I mean about that is this. At the end of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, just as a wave of violence erupted in the South against the newly freed people, Congress convened a joint committee to investigate the cause of the violence, and the committee took testimony all over the country. And during one such testimony, a white man testified to members of Congress by way of explaining why it is that Black people, mostly Black men, were experiencing violence as they tried to vote. And what he said to Congress was that, look, you have to understand, these are new people. He said, someone like me have been a person all my life. But these folks were not people before the 14th Amendment. They've only became people as a result of the 14th Amendment. So they don't quite understand what it means to function as a citizen. I've always found that sort of phrasing fascinating, in part because whenever you do that research, you sort of realize that eventually the phrase 14th Amendment person started to get used as a slur, right? That these were not real people. These were people who had been property until recently, and now it's only now that they needed a law for them to become a person. In his book, Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois said that Reconstruction was a worthwhile project that, had it been allowed to succeed, would have created a new world. And I've always wondered what he meant by that. What would it have meant if Reconstruction had succeeded for that new world to come about? So in my writing, what I try to do is to imagine what that new world could have been. And I don't do it by trying to fictionalize it. I do it by going back and reviewing and recreating and retelling the stories of ordinary people who lived during that time, during Reconstruction, and trying to understand what it is that they thought their life was going to be like as a result of the end of the war, right? There was a moment in American history in general, and American constitutional jurisprudence in particular, between Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson, between the bondage of cotton plantation and the segregation of drinking fountains, between the charnel house of the Gettysburg battlefield and the strange fruits hanging from southern trees, that the old world of chattel slavery had fallen apart, but had not yet reconstructed itself into what would become the new society of racial apartheid. And in that moment of change, between slavery and segregation, the country was in flux. Everything was uncertain. Much was unknown. And we had a moment where the world could have changed. And the best evidence of that moment is the lives of the ordinary people who experienced it. So that's what I write about. I try to tell the stories of their lives. There are a few to mention. One is a fascinating woman by the name of Sally Robinson, who was a plaintiff in one of the more famous or infamous constitutional case that students read, even though her name doesn't appear anywhere in the case. And the case is called the Civil Rights Cases, and it's a case where Sally and her husband sued a railroad called the Memphis Charleston Railroad Company because she had bought a first-class ticket. And when she boarded the train, the conductor of the train grabbed her and pulled her out of the first-class car and forced her to go sit in the second-class car. She was traveling then with a young man. And when the train left the station, the conductor went back and addressed the young man and told the young man, "Why are you trying to take this girl in the first-class car?" And the young man replied, "That's not a girl, that's my aunt." The young man ultimately in court papers was described as being young, white, fair and blue-eyed, whereas Sally seemed to be a woman of mixed race. And then when the conductor learned that in fact that he was white, he says, "Okay, you can take her back to the first-class car." When she got to Knoxville, she got off the train and she went to the office of the railroad to complain about her treatment. And when she wasn't satisfied with their response, she turned around and sued them, and she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. And hers was the first main case that sought to interpret the meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. What brought her to that moment? Why did she take the case all the way to the Supreme Court? And it so happened that Sally herself was originally born enslaved. Her first owner was her own father, and she objected to her treatment. And what I tried to do is that I tried to explain how this case came about, what Sally's life was like, what it meant for her to be treated with dignity. And the reason why I find the case fascinating is because, as I said, every single student in law school reads that case, every single one of them. But it is impossible to read that case and understand anything about Sally's life. Part of the reason why I do this research and the reason why it's so interesting is because the stories are interconnected. So as I was researching Sally's story, I came across the story of another individual, a couple actually, that ended up being my next article. It was a story of a couple out of Nashville, Tennessee, where the state of Tennessee spent 10 years prosecuting them for their marriage. They were an interracial couple. 10 years, twice. They sent them to prison twice. And I could never understand why Tennessee cared so much as to go after two people who had no money, no family, no connections, who seemed not to matter at all. Why go after them for so long? His name is David Galloway. Her name was Melinda Brendan. He himself was also born into slavery. He was also a veteran of the Civil War, and she herself was born in Nashville. She became an orphan when she was 5 years old because her parents died in a cholera epidemic that tended to sweep through the South every 10 years or so. She grew up with a nun in an orphanage, and when the nun closed the orphanage when she was barely 16, she became a sex worker in Nashville. And that's how they met when he left the army. And my entire research for David and Melinda was to try to understand what is it about them that caused them to be targeted? And why is it that they thought that they had the right to marry at the time when it was clear that it violated Tennessee law? And the funny thing is that as I was telling David and Melinda's story, which takes place over a number of years, I sort of lost track of them. When David got out of prison and went back to Melinda. And for a long time, and that happened even during the pandemic, I thought that, wow, this is one of those rare instances I'm going to get to have something of a happy ending. The librarian here at Georgetown, who are brilliant people, had managed to track down for me the entire collection of the Tennessee penitentiary system over a period of almost 50 years. So I spent hours and hours and hours and hours looking through those microfiche, looking for David and Melinda. One evening in the middle of the night, maybe 1, 2, or 3 in the morning, and I finally found them. And in fact, they went into jail together at the same time, one day in 1882. You see the entries for first for David, and then after 2 other entries, you see Melinda. Melinda was very hard to find because for most of her life, she changed names. She was born Melinda Brendan. She changed it to Galloway. But then for most of her life, if you were to track down the archives, her name was Melinda Vine. And I've always wondered, why did she choose Melinda Vine? And the reason why is because when she lived as an orphan with the nuns, right, the orphanage was located in the street. And that street right now is where the state capital of Tennessee is, Nashville. And every morning, the orphans would leave the orphanage with a basket to collect food at the market of the nations because the orphanage was pretty poor. And the front door of the orphanage on that street was Vine Street. So when Melinda was left alone on her own in Nashville at 16, and she had to make a living as a sex worker. She changed her name to Melinda Vine because Vine meant something to her. Looking back, as Du Bois himself says, it seemed inevitable that Reconstruction was bound to fail, that there were too many forces against it. But looking back, it seems inevitable. But I still think that the people who were living during that time, when the war was over, didn't think, oh yeah, Reconstruction is never going to succeed. No, I think they arranged their lives with the expectation as if they could reshape the world. It wasn't the case that they were naive. I think they knew exactly what they were facing, but they were living their lives as they imagined that they wanted it to be. That's why I think trying to go back and reconstruct the reality of their lives is so significant and meaningful for us to try to understand what that new world was supposed to be. The truth of the matter is, at the end of the war, Congress, led by the white Republicans, passed a number of extraordinary civil rights bills. Bills that were not only advanced for their times, but bills that were radically advanced even if you judge them by the standards of modern times. The reason why these pieces of legislation turned out to be ineffective is because the court blocked virtually every single one of them, including the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which did something very simple. The act was designed to prevent racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. The act did virtually the same thing that ultimately would end up doing again in 1964 with the new Civil Rights Act of 1964 after the Civil Rights Movement. So to me, the lesson is that the court has always been, and in some ways will always be, something of an obstacle. And whatever measure of progress that has been made has really been because of the court, but often in spite of it. Ultimately, the court may accept the reality of social progress and simply confer some judicial legitimacy in it. But whatever moment that we live in, right, if we can take any lesson from Reconstruction, the lesson is that the court is not and will never be our savior. The people themselves will be. The people themselves will save themselves, if you will.